sixth graders, welcome back to history. We are going to be finishing up our study on Egypt today with a short overview of the civilization of Kush. We are on page 82 in your book, and of course in your SAM, we've got a pyramid organizer for the Kushites on page 47. Let's get started. Now, gotta make sure I've got my dry erase marker out so I can write things on the board for you. To the south of Egypt, along the Nile River, was the kingdom of Kush. The kingdom of Kush extended from the first cataract of the Nile down to what is now the city of Khartoum in modern-day Sudan. You can actually look at the map on 85 to see that. In the same way that the Nile was important to Egypt, the Nile was very important to the Kushites. They depended on the Nile River for food, for water, for transportation, and for trade. So they had their own culture, but we're going to talk about how their culture kind of brought in Egyptian things into it. We'll get to that in a minute. The Kushites lived in villages where they were either farmers or animal herders. You can look on page 82 and you can see a picture of a tomb painting from the land of Kush that shows Kushites leading some different animals, among which is a giraffe. And then it looks like on the giraffe there's maybe a baboon, some different animals in that picture. So they were animal herders or farmers. They used an irrigation system the same as the Egyptians did. And they did this to, of course, water their crops the same way that the Egyptians did. They were able to farm more land because of this. Now, in the southern part of Kush, there was more savanna area, and because of that, they were able to raise cattle there. Now, a savanna is a flat, grassy plain. On the continent of Africa, the savanna is located below. There are areas of savanna below or south of the Sahara Desert. One of the interesting things about Kush is they had a large amount of natural resources. All kinds of natural resources. They had gold. They had copper. They had different kinds of stone. They had very good soil, very fertile soil. They had ebony. We often think of ebony as a color now, especially in our culture because ebony trees don't grow in North America, but they had ebony, which is a kind of tree known for its very, very hard wood, and it's very, very dark wood as well. They also had ivory. Now, you may know that ivory is basically teeth. It's the same thing that it's a specific kind of it's not exactly teeth, but it's basically the same stuff. Ivory comes from elephant tusks or rhinoceros horns. Now, today, the ivory trade has been banned. If you own something that's made out of ivory, it was probably made and purchased at least 50 years ago. In fact, the piano that I have in my house belonged to my grandmother, and it has ivory veneer on the white keys. And that piano was made in the mid-20th century before the ivory trade was banned. Because a lot of times people will just kill the animal to get its tusk or to get its horn. And so they've banned that in the interest of these animals not going extinct. The Kushites had a more limited diet than the Egyptians because they had less fertile ground for farming. So they ate wheat and barley and different kinds of vegetables. They, of course, ate fish from the Nile. They ate cattle. They ate birds. Also, and I think this is very interesting, I think you'll find this interesting, is they ate hippopotamus. They ate ostrich, and they ate turtle on special occasions. So a hippo, an ostrich, and a turtle were special occasion foods. They used palm wood, and they used bricks for building, and they made clay pottery. So they were people who used what they had to make their buildings and their surroundings. They used a bow and arrow to hunt, and they were great hunters. They hunted elephants, they hunted lions, leopards, panthers. They would also use elephants as work animals. So they would tame elephants and use them as work animals. And sometimes they would trade these amazing animals to other civilizations for the things that they needed. Now, much like Egyptian civilization, the women in Kush had a variety of different things that they could do. There were female Kushite warriors, which is very interesting, as well as Kushite queens and Kushite priestesses. However, most women were still the primary caregivers of the children and the people who maintained and ran the household. The people of Kush had two different writing systems, two different written languages. One of their systems was a form of hieroglyphics, and I have to look because I always want to write the E first, but it's the I. One was a form of hieroglyphics, similar to Egyptian hieroglyphics. The other was a form of handwriting or script with symbols that looked like letters rather than pictures. This script is called Meroitic or Meroitic. 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 Meroitic was named after the people of Meroe, which was the ancient city that first used the language. So they named it after the people who used it. The Kushites were polytheistic in their religion, like the Egyptians, and they had their primary god's name was Amun, and he had a head of a sheep. So you may remember in some of the other Egyptian religion that we talked about that there was a jackal-headed god, there was a falcon-headed god. Well, the Kushites had a sheep-headed god, ram-headed god named Amun. And they had very similar architecture, pyramids and temples, similar to Egyptian pyramids. You can actually see a picture of a Kushite pyramid on page 83. They look a little bit different. They're a little bit narrower than the pyramids in Egypt, but nonetheless, it's similar architecture. For about 500 years, oh, wait, I got ahead of myself. Sorry about that. Let's go back. So, one of the things that we've talked about is that sometimes you get a big civilization that starts out as a village. And the Kushites are one of those civilizations. They began as a strong village and over time continued to grow in power. They developed into a civilization. This little village becomes a city and becomes a city-state and grows in power until it becomes a civilization. The people of Kush established the city of Kerma as their capital city, and they began trading with Egypt. Now, as the Kushites became wealthier and bigger, the Egyptians were not happy about the fact that the Kushites were growing in power. They were very nervous about that, and so they did what civilizations were prone to do back then. They're like, I don't like you, I'm going to conquer you. And that's what they did. The Egyptians, during the Middle Kingdom, there was a pharaoh that led his army to invade Kush. They completely destroyed the city of Kerma and conquered the Kushite people. Over time, the Kushites really began assimilating and adopting Egyptian culture. And by this I mean they began dressing like Egyptians, they began worshiping the Egyptian gods, and they changed the Egyptian hieroglyphics to fit their language. So they took all of these things from the Egyptian culture and just kind of assimilated them into Kushite culture. Egypt dominated the Kushites for about 500 years. But toward the end of the New Kingdom, Kush became stronger. Egypt lost control, and the Kushites actually began to call their king a pharaoh, and the city of Napata became their capital city. There was a Kushite pharaoh named Pi, it's spelled P-I-Y-E, Pi, and under Pi, Kush eventually conquered Egypt. Remember I told you in the last lesson, toward the end of the New Kingdom, how the pharaohs after Ramses the Great just were kind of weak, and this is what happened, is the Kushites conquered them. Around the 600s BC, the Assyrians, who were, you will remember them from ancient Mesopotamia, were a very powerful and very ruthless group of people. They came in and invaded Egypt while the Kushites were ruling Egypt. The Assyrians had iron weapons, and the Kushites weren't able to defend their kingdom. And so the Assyrians were the ones who drove the Kushites out of Egypt. So the Kushites go back to their land, and they established a new capital at Meroe. And around that area, so they established their new kingdom, and the area around Meroe, they discovered iron ore deposits. This is very important because if you'll remember, it was iron weapons that the Assyrians used to defeat them. They discovered iron ore deposit, and that became a very valuable trade item. So Kush was able to not only export the gold and the ivory and the leopard skins and the ostrich feathers and the elephants and all the things they exported before, but now they were able to export iron weapons and iron tools as well. They also exported slaves. They imported other things. One of the main things they imported was jewelry. Around 400 years later, the Kushite civilization kind of goes into a decline. Basically what happened was they had used up all of their natural resources. Instead of kind of conserving, they just sort of assumed it would last forever, and they used them all up. Eventually, they had nothing. They had burned all the trees as fuel without replanting. The savannas were overgrazed, which meant the cattle herds got smaller. Trade began to go down because they didn't have as much stuff to trade with other nations. And so they continued to get weaker and weaker and weaker. And to the southeast of Kush, in the land that we know of as Ethiopia today, there was a civilization called the Aksum civilization that developed. And eventually, the Aksum, A-K-S-U-M, the Aksum civilization was the civilization that destroyed Meroe, took over the land of Kush, and they did this in the year AD 330. So the Kushite civilization had existed for over 1,000 years. You can actually look at page 84, there's a timeline, and it goes from 2500 BC when the capital of Kerma was established through the history of the Kushite kingdom and when Aksum conquered it. So you can kind of get an idea of where Kush lands in the scheme of things. I do want you to look at page 85 for me, please. There is a map there of Kush as it was then and what's there now. You can look at the map and you can see that there is a darker green area, and that is the kingdom of Kush. And you can see where the three cities, the three different capital cities, were located during that time. And you can see that it is located right along the Nile River in the countries of modern day Sudan. No, it's all in modern day Sudan. Sorry, I was looking at Eritrea too. All in the modern day country of Sudan. I keep wanting to say Suzanne. Oh my goodness. Sudan. Now, I do want to say that this just very recently, so this happened since this book was printed, that Sudan is now two countries, Sudan and South Sudan. Oh wait, no, there it is. Boy, did I mess that up. Okay, so South Sudan is there. You can see that Kush was entirely in the country that is now known as Sudan. And you can see where the Sudanese city of Khartoum is, right where the Blue Nile and the White Nile diverge from the Nile River. So that's very interesting. There's one more thing I want to talk about, and that is the Aswan High Dam. This is something that I think is really important, and this is important today. In Egypt, there have been floods and droughts as part of Egyptian history from the very beginning. I mean, there were floods and droughts all the way along, and in Genesis 41, it's mentioned as well. There would be years that the Nile River would flood more than expected, destroying crops, and Egyptians were trying to control the water of the annual floods, and in the late 1890s, Egypt was under British control. And during this time period, they began to construct a dam. The dam was completed in 1902, and it is very near the border of Egypt and Sudan. And you can see on page 85, Lake Nasser. That's going to be important here in just a second. What the dam did was it helped control the flooding, so they could release the water when they wanted to and hold it in a reservoir to release it when they needed it, but to keep it back. Over the next 30 years, so between 1902 and 1930, the height of the dam was raised. They added hydroelectric generators so they could generate electricity. By the 1940s, the height of the dam had to be raised again. But instead of doing that, what they did was they decided to build another dam further upstream. This dam, this second dam, is known as the Aswan High Dam, and it was completed in 1970. The first dam, which is now known as the Old Aswan Dam, is still there, but it doesn't have as much function. It's not as important. Here's what happened. The Aswan High Dam formed Lake Nasser. The water began covering so much of the ancient Egyptian architecture. It began covering temples and tombs and villages of ancient Kush. And archaeologists from many countries came in to try to save as many artifacts as they could. In fact, there were these huge temples of Abu Simbel, which you can see a picture of on page 86. These were some of the things that Ramses II built. The temples of Abu Simbel, they moved them. They literally moved them. They used all the technology that we have in modern times, and they moved these temples to higher ground. Some of the other monuments they couldn't move, and so they just documented them, took pictures, took measurements before the water covered them. Not everyone approves of the dam, obviously, because of the destruction of all of these ancient artifacts. Another reason they don't is because silt, which is the good stuff that comes out when it floods and lands on the land, making it fertile, all of the silt is trapped behind the dam. So all of the area below the dam no longer gets the silt, so it no longer has that natural fertilizer, which means that Egyptian farmers now have to use chemical fertilizers. The dams also affected fishing and people downstream. So remember, the Aswan Dam is down here, but this is downstream because the Nile flows north. The people north, downstream, who depended on fishing for their livelihood can no longer do that. So there are always pros and cons when we build things like this as humans, but I just think it's really interesting how the Aswan High Dam was able to bring some things to Egypt that they needed, but it also took some things away. And so whenever we make decisions like this that are going to affect lots of people, we have to really think about it. Now, that means we are finished with this chapter. So we're going to have a couple of days of time to do study guide in class, and then on Thursday, you'll take your test. So good luck, and I'll see you later.